Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Ghoul Guides Association, the not-so-secret organisation for all things Gothic and pop culture. We are your Ghoul Guides. I am Lauren.
And I'm Mary.
And today we have a review episode. And it's a rare treat because we are reviewing a horror movie that both of us have seen.
Yeah.
Which I think the last time we did this was maybe Crimson Peak.
I always like it when there's a film that Lauren either has already seen and she's like, I've seen this film, let's talk about it, or that I find a film that like Lauren can watch. So I'm very excited to kind of...
It's a big deal when it happens.
Yeah.
Because it's so rare that there's something that I can sit through. And if you listen to our comeback episode, you might have already heard this, but it might otherwise just be no surprise, considering that it was the Gothic film of last year, really, that the film in question is Nosferatu. And it's just come out on DVD in the last kind of couple weeks, and we thought, we're back in business, why don't we talk about Nosferatu? So, Mary, do you want to tell those lucky folks who perhaps don't know much about the history of this one about Nosferatu and its origins?
Yeah, so this film is actually a remake of a 1922 German silent film called Nosferatu, or A Symphony of Horror. And this was very amazing, especially because it's so with a lot of silent films. Sometimes there are scores because obviously there's no dialogue, and you'll have like intertitles with dialogue written, but like there's no like spoken dialogue. But there might be scores and there might not. So if you were lucky enough to have seen this live, you might have seen it with like a new score, which I think just makes it really interesting. But this film, so the film that came out this year, it isn't a silent film. It very much does have dialogue. And it is directed by Robert Eggers, stars Bill Skarsgård as Count Orlok, Nicholas Hoult as Thomas Hatter, and also Lily Rose Depp as Ellen Hatter. And if you don't know who any of these people are, that's fine, although you probably do.
You probably do, even if you don't.
Yeah, you probably do. And obviously Bill Skarsgård, very famous for being one of the Skarsgård.
I was just about to say, being a Skarsgård. If you like things vampire, then you probably know the Skarsgårds anyway, because famously his brother Alexander was Eric in True Blood.
Yeah. But he's already got his horror credentials. He plays Pennywise the Clown in the recent remake of the It films. Nicholas Hoult, obviously, for all you Skins fans out there, going way back, or I guess maybe the X-Men franchise more recently.
We don't talk about that. That brings up more trauma than my teenage years, which were the Skins era.
And Lily Rose Depp, I think this might be one of her first, if not her first, like kind of film outings.
Yeah, she's done quite a bit of modelling. But I think this is her first big role. And I know that a lot of people kind of, when the casting announced, had a bit of an eye roll because there's such a huge conversation at the moment in pop culture about Nepo babies, which I actually think we could really do really fun Gothic interrogation of the discourse around Nepo babies. But yeah, I think this was her first big role.
Yeah. And then obviously Robert Eggers. So I think this is one of the reasons why why there's been so much hype about this film.
Yeah.
Because Robert Eggers, if you don't know him, he's had several really, really interesting horror-y films already. So first of all, you have The Witch, which came out in 2015, and it is a brilliant satanic period witch horror film set in 17th century New England, and launched the amazing Black Phillip.
Dost thou wish to live deliciously?
Yes. The answer is obviously yes.
Always, yeah.
You then also, a couple of years later, you have, in 2019, you have his creepy lighthouse horror, which I don't know. Have you seen that, Lauren?
Oh, I have seen it, but I haven't seen it in full. So
Okay.
I've seen it because TikTok lost its shit over this film.
Yeah.
And there was a lot of cuts and stuff, but also at the time I was working, so not the kind of the year after it came out, so when it was like on, you know, DVD and streaming and stuff. I was working on the Haunted Shores project, which is, if you're unfamiliar, a really great research project run by some fantastic academics, which is all about coastal and, as it might, you know, say by the name, shoreline Gothic, and it being a lighthouse focused film where famously Robert Pattinson has a really interesting scene with a mermaid. We did talk about it with that. The other reason that I watched bits of it, is Mary knows this, is I am an OG Robert Pattinson fangirl. I stopped watching the Harry Potter movies after the fourth one, but I watched the fourth one repeatedly as a teenager because I thought he was beautiful. And then, of course, he was Edward in Twilight, and he's just a funky little guy. I find him hysterical, but I also do think I genuinely do think he's a really good actor. So I wouldn't want to say, I would feel wrong. I would feel dishonest if I said I had seen that film, because I haven't. I've seen a selection of scenes from that film, but I've seen enough to know the vibes.
Interesting, because I actually haven't seen this film. So maybe it's one that we could watch.
Maybe we could. It's more it's more my kind of Gothic. Yeah. It's the creepy, you're not sure what's happening, kind of very unsettling, very uncomfortable, less than it is a horror movie. It's got that thing, you know, in The Witch where like you just feel, you know, something's wrong and you feel uncomfortable. It's got a lot of that, but it's more about like the effects of that type of life on somebody's mind. And it's that kind of like, is this happening or is it not kind of thing.
I mean, that sounds great. I do like those kinds of films as well. Maybe we should watch it and talk about it. But yeah, and then his last film before Nosferatu was The Northman, which came out in 2022, which is basically Viking Hamlet. So it is kind of maybe less like horror, but it has got quite, I mean, it's a little bit actiony. And I think there's lots of like gothic-y, creepy vibes.
Did that have Alexander Skarsgård in it?
It did, yeah, it did.
That's the only reason I thought about watching it.
It was good. I think some people found it too long, but I'm like, well, you know, it's Hamlet, so you know, but yeah, like, so these are all I mean, very different projects, but I think what unites them is like it blends Eggers' interest in horror and folklore and mythology with kind of historical stories. And if that hasn't kind of like whetted your appetite for Nosferatu, I will also plug that his next project is set to be a 13th century werewolf film. So again, you can see like he's very...
Yes, isn't he doing like the Beast of Geverdon type?
Yeah. So it's very, again, very, very different projects. You know, you've got this New England Puritan film, a lighthouse mermaid film, a Viking Hamlet, and a vampire remake, and then a werewolf film set in the 13th century. But I think there's a kind of Eggers style that I think you find in a lot of his works. And
I think, you know, having watched interviews with him around Nosferatu, both just out of interest as a gothicist and also when I was thinking about, you know, how I felt about the film and going back and looking at some interviews and stuff, I think I'm going to say something and you're either going to go, oh my God, yes, or what the fuck are you talking about? He very much is like a directorial version of Silvia Moreno Garcia for me.
Okay, yeah.
So Silvia Moreno Garcia is the author of Mexican Gothic. And she does this thing where like everything she writes is a different genre. So she's done everything from like 1970s noir to, you know, young adult fantasy to fin de siècle high society. Her most recent paperback is The Seventh Veil of Salome, which I'm partway through right now, which is set in the kind of post-Golden Age Hollywood, the 1950s. It's about a biblical, you know, the era of the biblical film. Mm-hmm. The actors involved in this, you know, biblical film about Salome, and it's also interspersed with the actual story of Salome and John the Baptist. And she does this thing where, like, whatever, she's done sci-fi, she's done romance, but whatever genre she's doing, she's her. And I think it's because she loves genre so much. She loves the way that genres play together. She loves the expectations and subversions of genre. And I think Eggers, as a director, and he talks about this in some of the Nosferatu interviews, loves genre, and he loves cinema. And I think it's really interesting that they both also, like, one of their first loves is the Gothic, because they're both really good at having a noticeable, like, identifiable style, but doing it in these wildly different set pieces.
Yeah, I think, there's two things that I would say about Eggers, is that he is very much a filmmaker who knows and loves the craft. He puts a lot of effort into thinking about how he's going to shoot and film different scenes and what the effect that he wants is. They're all his films, they're shot beautifully, they're beautifully stylized, and he does have a specific style as well, but you can tell that he's studied film and appreciates it, like it's not just that he's doing it for a job. You can tell there's a lot of passion there, and also you can tell that, you know, there's lots of loving genre nods. I think that, he is a fan of genre, which is always nice. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it's an Eggers film. We've got some, you know, some big names in there, some newcomers in there. We've mentioned it's a remake. Do you want to tell the people about the 1922 original movie in a little bit more detail?
Yeah.
And then I can give a little bit of a history lesson.
So this film was created, it was directed by someone called Friedrich Wilhelm Murnau, or F.W. Murnau, as he's more likely known. He was a German director, screenwriter, and producer during the 1920s, which I know you'll come on to the history of that period in a bit. And this is probably the film that he's best known for, definitely now. Nosferatu wasn't that successful in this period. Again, I know you're going to touch on this, so I won't say why it wasn't that successful. But now, definitely, if you say to anyone F.W. Murnau, they'll say Nosferatu. He did also direct a really great adaptation of Faust.
Yes.
But yeah, he was very much a pioneer in what we now call German Expressionism, which was a kind of silent, you know, when film was becoming a kind of new media, and there was a lot of really interesting things that were happening in Germany, especially in terms of filmmaking. He was, I don't know if you're going to talk about this, but he was a soldier in the First World War, which I think you can see some of the influence on that.
Yeah.
And he was also gay. So he had a friend and a lover who died in the Second World War. And I think a lot of his works have the themes, and they draw on what we could think about in terms of the horrors of love, and the horrors of loss, and the horrors of sacrifice and violence, which I think you do see a little bit in Nosferatu.
There's a lot around trauma in there, I think.
But yeah, but then in 1926, Murnau emigrated to Hollywood and started making films over in America, as a lot of people did.
Many people did.
Yes,
for reasons.
Yeah, which maybe is a good time to kind of hand over to you to talk about the historical context.
Yes. So there's two kind of big points when it comes to the historical context for this film. And whilst this isn't a deep down into the origins of the original Nosferatu, we thought it was important to kind of touch on and consider the socio-political climate of 1922 and this film being made, not only because it influences the source text, but it also is really fascinating when we look at 2024 and the socio-political climate that Eggers' Nosferatu is being released into, because, you know, the roaring 20s and the rise of fascism could be a descriptor for 1922 or 2022. Hard to say. So this film was very much informed by the aftermath of the First World War and the horrors of the First World War. It's very important that this is a German film, and that this is a film that is responding to a massive, obviously, a loss, that is responding to a country trying to reconcile itself, to understand itself, to redefine itself. And a country that has a lot of progressiveness in that post-war. This, you know, Germany in the 20s was experiencing a really wonderful wave of acceptance and of kind of change and openness. But it was also a country that was racked by economic doubt, by tensions around what borders mean and what nationality means, and a population that, you know, there's very few people that had not lost or experienced loss. Germany had become, you know, once again, not once again, because this was the First World War, but Germany had become this kind of pariah. You see those scenes of, you know, people queuing up to buy bread with wheelbarrows full of money. And it was also, as with the rest of Europe and the rest of the world really, reeling from a global pandemic, which was the Spanish influenza. And what you see in that original film is a lot of anxiety about plague and about a pandemic and about infection and the transmission of infection and how we respond to infection and what infection does to us. So it's really, really important that this is a post-war film and a post-pandemic film. And I think it's really something that translates into the 2024 version. And one of the things that we see, I think, in Nosferatu is that ugliness and that desperation of loss, of love, of uncertainty. And I think we have to always remember that it is, really heavily informed by the Spanish influenza. I mean, the Spanish influenza was devastating. And the fact that it kind of was a global pandemic because of the First World War, a lot of people kind of felt like the world had ended. And it echoed strongly the Romantic period of the post-Napoleonic. You'd had this huge global war. You'd had massive environmental impact, not only by the war, but you'd had the year without summer, the eruption of the volcano that I now cannot remember the name of, but that, you know, impacted so significantly in 1817 and even into 1818. The kind of post-Spanish influenza, post-World War I period is very similar to that. And that's why things like German Expressionism were so significant. But the other thing is that, unfortunately, as often happens when you have progress and revolution and art and culture, you know, Germany was the home of the first LGBTQ health clinic. You'd got film and you'd got art. It was also seeing a progressive rise and trend towards not just right-wing conservatism, but fascism. And I think you could easily watch Nosferatu, either version, and not necessarily pick that up. But I think when you place it historically in its context and you think about what someone like Murnau would have been experiencing in 1922 and watching his own society, his own culture kind of shift, the increasing trend towards anti-Semitism, the increasing ableist rhetorics, the rejection of Roma culture, which is something that is picked up from somewhere else that I'm going to talk about in a second. But, you know, it's coming at a very tense political moment, and you can really see that in the films. I think it's really important to just mention those two historical contexts. But the other thing that's important to mention is that it is, yes, in fact, kind of a rip-off of Dracula. Which has been really interesting watching people, even the people I went to see it in the cinema with, they were like, very similar to Dracula, isn't it?
Sometimes you forget that, like, that's not well known, like, especially because, like, you know, I guess there are a lot of people that are engaging with Eggers Nosferatu that haven't seen, you know, the original film. So they're not. It's not even like, you know, oh, that's really interesting, like, adaptation. But this is like a double adaptation because, like you say, it is loosely, but, you know, quite clearly based in Dracula.
So Florence Balcombe, who was Bram Stoker's widow, did actually sue the production company for copyright infringement, and this is one of the reasons that this film didn't really become the success that it has become over time, because Balcombe had quite a strong case, and it's actually one of the first cases of copyright infringement, and we have Balcombe and this case to kind of thank for all of this happening. And you'll sometimes hear like, oh, you know, we can use that because it's pre-1922. You know, the reason there's so many different versions of Charles Dickens and Jane Austen is because they're not in copyright. And that's because this was that moment where it was like, oh, well, who owns this? Stoker was dead, but that text was still his text. Balcombe owned the right, you know, he had left her the rights, but it wasn't well codified. It wasn't well protected. And all of a sudden, this German, quite art housey, you know, film studio is ostensibly using Dracula. And there are some really strong crossovers, particularly at the beginning. The entire plot of a young lawyer / real estate agent going to the castle of this, you know, Central European, like, lord, and he has these strange experiences, and then he wants to come into the city, and, you know, you've got the kind of Mina type character, and in Nosferatu it's more of an amalgamation of Mina and Lucy, but there's a very clear infringement on the boundaries of Dracula here.
What I think is really interesting, and I'm not sure in which film he was cast first, but I think it's really smart casting of Nicholas Hoult, because he in this film he plays what is essentially the Jonathan Harker type character, the young lawyer who goes into Eastern Europe to meet this count, comes back home, and then the count follows him, which, you know, structurally it's the same in both Dracula and Nosferatu. But like a film that came out earlier, and again, I don't know in which he was cast first, but there's a film that came out called Renfield, where he plays Jonathan Harker. So he is literally in this film and then in Renfield playing that same character. And I just think that's really, really interesting. And I think, a smart casting choice for both films, whichever cast him first and second.
I think Nicholas Hoult as well, like, you know, he was in things like Warm Bodies, which is a sort of YA zombie film. Yeah. Like, similar to Bill Skarsgård, like, he's on multiple levels, like, a really good casting for Thomas because of that. So, yeah, we have this major, like, world-changing copyright infringement case that, unfortunately, did hinder the film. There were other things, things like originals being lost. There's quite too much to go into here, but there's a very complicated history around the making, the production, and the release, and this kind of the protection of the legacy, shall we say, of the original silent movie, which I would definitely recommend kind of going and researching if you're interested. But it's just really important to mention, of course, not only that it is so inspired by Dracula, and particularly, Murnau picks up on that homoeroticism in Dracula. And there's an argument to be made that the reason that so many people now think Dracula is a love story, and that the more recent, and when I say recent, I mean like in the last 30 years, adaptations of Dracula have focused on this idea that Dracula is in love with Nina, come from the cultural impact and the cult following that Nosferatu gained. Nosferatu did become, the image of his shadow creeping up the stairs on the wall. Even if you didn't know Nosferatu, you probably have seen that image. In the same way, it has the same cultural significance as the Hammer horror Frankenstein, Frankenstein's creature. So, yeah, very heavily inspired by Dracula, but transplanted into that German setting. And what is significant, I think, and the reason that, again, I want to make that clear, because I kept thinking this when I was watching it. And again, I'm interested in nationhood, so of course it was something I was thinking of, but Dracula is very much about British anxieties around nation and empire and boundaries and Orientalism and, where does the boundary of Europe and civilization stop? And how do we respond to this increasing, melting pot version of London? And what's that going to do to gender and class and all of these other things? And I think that transplanting that into Germany, into a German setting. So yes, it's not set in 1922, but it's still set in Germany, and it's set, against this socio-political backdrop. I think you get that, well, what is Dracula doing? Okay, well, we see there what Nosferatu is doing. So yeah, really, really major, really massive precedent-setting copyright case. And yeah, poor old Florence Balcombe, desperately trying to protect this legacy of her dead husband's novel, and also like her money. They weren't super loaded, but I'm not going to go into that.
No, but again, like Dracula also, when it came out, it wasn't, it wasn't commercially like a runaway success. And I think that maybe part of the reason why both texts, like the Nosferatu film and the novel Dracula, now have such a kind of like cult status and pop culture influence, it's because of this copyright case. So in a way, it helped both of them.
Yeah. Something. No publicity is bad publicity.
Yeah.
So those are the kind of major historical contexts we wanted to touch on. But one of the other things that Nosferatu does that is in Dracula, but Nosferatu kind of takes it that step further, is the occultism aspect of it. So this is something that sits way more in your wheelhouse than in mine, Mary. So do you want to mention that a little bit? Because I feel like the Eggers NOSFERATU really kind of like leaned into it. I remember kind of getting quite excited when he's in the village and they're like a Strigoi. I was like, ooh, this is some real vampire folklore. But it has a lot more of that occultism compared to, I mean, it's in Dracula, like it's not there. And obviously when Van Helsing comes in, you've got that. But
in Dracula, Van Helsing provides the kind of the info dump, as you were, like this is who like Dracula was, and it implies that he went to a kind of devil school / devil mountain and had this pact with the devil, and that's why, like, that's where his vampirism comes from, and it's kind of like Faustian and alchemical in the book, according to Van Helsing. In Nosferatu, Murnau's Nosferatu, you also have that. Count Orlok is very much associated with Belial, who is, thank you, Paradise Lost, one of Satan's kind of like archdemons. And he's also one that's associated with plague. So again, thinking about this film in its post-pandemic context, here you have someone who is demonic and satanic who is threatening to kind of bring the plague. And you also have that with all of the rat imagery as well that's associated with Orlok, which we'll come back to very shortly. But in terms of like the occultism, like you say, it does bring it up because in Dracula, he has a kind of agent in the Renfield character, who is someone who is in an insane asylum. Here in Nosferatu, you have Thomas Hutter's boss, Hernok, who, so I keep mixing them up. Thomas Hutter, not Jonathan. Thomas is a kind of junior in a law solicitor firm, and Hernok is his boss. And it's Hernok that sends him to Count Orlok. And what you see is that actually Hernok has been corresponding with Orlok, and they have this correspondence that is very occult. It's almost ritualistic in the way that they talk to each other. A lot of the language is based in Enochian, which is not a real language. It's kind of invented language that's connected to like sometimes the angelic, sometimes the demonic. And he seemed to kind of have like this kind of Kabbalistic kind of practice where he is inviting this satanic kind of occult threat in. What's interesting and problematic about this film is that Hernok is explicitly Jewish. And then you then have all of this anti-Semitism that is there in the film. And I will say, Murnau, I don't think Murnau was himself anti-Semitic. He had Jewish friends. And also the actor that plays Hernok was Jewish, which I find really weird. But there is this symbolism of not just, this, well, I mean, it's there, it's overt, right? That you have this foreign threat that's coming from the East, that is coming, it's bringing plague, and it's coming through rats. And we know that like that kind of rodent imagery, even before like the kind of the Nazi era in Germany, it was an anti-Semitic trope that associated Jews with this kind of subhuman animalistic threat that also brought plague. And then you also have that idea that there are people in society that are communicating with this foreign threat, and they're bringing they're bringing it down from within, which I think we can't ignore from the film. I don't know if that's what Murnau intended, but that is what the film presents.
I think
kind of occult conspiracy.
Yeah, and it's that kind of thing where like, even if he doesn't intend it, and we're seeing this a lot at the moment, where when you are inside of a state that is becoming increasingly bigoted in one or more respects, and Germany was, even if you are part of the progressive left, which Murnau was, I think you sometimes don't realise what's reflecting back on you. Orlok's design, the inherently Jewish nature of the alchemy and the occultism. That's not the only occultism that exists in Europe. There could have been a different version, but that's the one that they choose. And there is, as you've talked about before, not only on Sundays with Dracula and here, but in your book, there is also an anti-Semitic undercurrent to something like Dracula. But I think it's just so unavoidable in the 1922 film, because whether consciously or unconsciously, it's whether it's a reflection on or a reflection back, like we know that that's something that's happening at that point in time.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah, which, has, so just really quickly before we talk about Eggers' film, we mentioned that this wasn't an instant success, and actually other of Murnau's films were more successful at the time. One reason for that was, of course, the copyright infringement case with Balcombe. It had all sorts of implications for the way the film was released, for the financing. There was just lots of strange things that happened within the studio as well, things that prevented it from being like widely distributed, and also, of course, the increasing tensions in Europe. Well, I say increasing, like they'd not just had a war, but it did have a big impact on the success of the film and the reception of the film. And a lot of people, particularly in Britain, were quite displeased to hear that, this film supposedly was a rip-off of a British author, even though a lot of English people disliked Stoker because he was Irish, because all sorts. It's the classic. It's kind of like when Andy Murray wins a match.
That's what I was thinking. When he wins, he's British, but when he loses, he's Scottish.
Yeah. So that particularly in the UK, there was quite a negative reaction to the film because of the Balcombe case. And it kind of then, of course, languid because as Hitler took power in the late 20s and into the early 30s, and we moved towards things like censorship, as Mary said, Murnau had to flee. He was one of the many LGBTQ German people that had to leave for either the US or for other countries. It kind of languid. But after the Second World War, it had a bit of a revival. Particularly when the kind of golden era of early horror, things like Hammer, Nosferatu was a lot of people's inspiration. So it actually became, as with many Gothic texts, became more popular into the 50s and the 60s. And then, a lot of people in the 70s and 80s with horror B movies. And it is now very much a cult classic, one that is not without its criticism because of that anti-Semitic aspect that Mary's talked about. But I think it has such an incredible impact on contemporary horror and Gothic, even if you didn't know that that's what it was. Yeah, so it has had a massive, huge pop culture influence on many, many aspects. And it's no wonder that someone like Eggers wanted to remake it, especially because it's kind of ripe for a remaking. It's a short, silent film.
Yeah.
There's a lot that you don't see because it's on title cards and it's on dialogue cards, and there's a lot to play with there.
One film that I do want to mention just before we move on to talking about Eggers' film is the 2000 film Shadow of the Vampire. Have you heard of this film, Lauren?
I mean, I probably have, because that's such a basic name. I feel like I probably have.
So the reason why I bring this up here, and I won't talk too much about it. This can just be a very short and sweet recommend. But it is a film. It's a fictionalized version about the making of the 1922 Nosferatu
yes, I have
film.
Heard about this.
But the premise of it is that Murnau actually went and got a real vampire.
Yes.
So he's trying to film this film, and the actor person that is playing Count Orlok is actually a vampire, and no one else on set knows. And obviously, then people do start dying, and it's very mysterious and all of this kind of stuff. And he throws a fit about, I think, the boat scene, and it's very very funny. And if you haven't seen it, and if you enjoyed either Eggers' film or the Nosferatu film, or just want more of this kind of stuff, I think this is a really interesting take on, it's not a remake in the way that Eggers' film is remaking it, but it is, it's very fun.
Yes, I remember reading about that as a little baby undergrad goth when I was looking into the whole Balcombe case. When we did Modern Gothic. So yes, I do. I do remember reading about that.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's a bit of a quick semi-history lesson, semi-context explainer on Nosferatu. I mean, God, there's so much around it and so much that we could say. But we just thought it was probably important for us to kind of not only share that context in case you didn't know it, but also to give some framework for where we're coming to, like what we were thinking when we were sitting down to watch this film and what we had in our heads.
And I will say as well, so this film came out in the start of January, or the end of December. When I found out that Lauren had seen it, and that we'd both seen it, I was like so excited. But I also said, I'm not going to tell you my thoughts. I'm going to save them for when we do this episode. So we actually haven't shared our thoughts. So I'm very excited. No. I'm very, very excited to hear what you think about the film.
Just messaged you and said, please be proud of me. I went to the cinema and I watched Nosferatu.
And I still am very, very proud.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So I guess that's a good point to start. Like, from as somebody who is not good with the visceral nature of horror and who struggles with jump scares and body horror, I really appreciated the way that Nosferatu leaned back into the kind of like mystery of the monster, and it's quite a wide, like when Thomas is first in the castle, you're not 100% sure what's going on. But I also really loved the way that it informed you of the cues, so you could still be scared and worried. For example, the scene where Hernok, I knew it was going to happen. He's holding that bird. And obviously, like, he's the Renfield character. And I was like, okay, this is going to happen. It's going to happen. And I was able to look away at the right moment. And I knew even that there was going to be the trick moment. Like, I could tell that it was going to make you think that that was the moment to look away and then look back. So I know it's kind of a weird thing to be like, I appreciate that the horror film wasn't too scary. But what I really loved was that as a genre film, it did such a beautiful job of using the generic conventions and communicating to you sort of what was going on and the tension builds and things like that. So I think I only really had to look away twice. But from that perspective,
yeah,
very watchable if, like me, you struggle with the visual nature of horror.
There's no shade, absolutely no shade to needing to look away from any film, and also whatever you're watching. I have quite a bad needle phobia, and any time in any film, whether that be a horror film or just a normal film or just TV, there's a needle, I'm looking away. So yeah, no shade and no judgment from me. You as long as you enjoy what you actually are watching, then yeah
exactly.
Okay,
so let's start with the
so shall I say like a kind of TLDR of what I thought?
Go on,
because I've been holding this in for like I don't know how many months. I really wanted to like love this film, and there's lots of things that I do like about it. I think it's beautifully shot. And if you made the film into like stills, if you had every single shot as stills and put it in like an art gallery, I'd be like, amazing. This is so good. It looks so beautiful.
The cinematography.
The cinematography is good. There was something about it that I just couldn't quite, I came out and I was like, I don't know.
Yeah.
And one of it is, so I like the effort that was put into making Orlok monstrous and making it a monster that was scary. But for me, that was all undercut by the moustache. Which, and I know that Eggers has gone, in several, he stands by the moustache.
There's a lot of discourse about the moustache.
He stands by the moustache and he says, it's historically accurate. And, if you're going by the whole Vlad the Impaler, which I personally think Bram Stoker wrote and researched a Dracula novel, and then somewhere near the end he found this kind of Vlad the Impaler stuff and put some stuff in, but I don't think that is necessarily, he didn't start making a Vlad the Impaler thing. And also like Orlok isn't Vlad the Impaler.
No.
I don't know, he just reminded me too much. Every time he was on screen I just was like, it's like Wario, it's like Mario, it's so I know. So, and I know that that's really bad because
no, it's not.
Because I think I appreciate it. Like if I watched that film and someone has taken out the moustache, I think I would find it so much more scary, and so much more effective. Just even as a kind of like creation of a monster. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. And so this is something that I was going to say is, I actually didn't find it scary.
Yeah.
I enjoyed it a lot as a Gothic film.
Yeah.
I enjoyed it a lot as a storytelling experience. And I also enjoyed it a lot as someone who, you know, if something's post-war, if something's about nation, if something's about masculinity, I'm there, I'm in, I'm down. I really want to talk about Aaron Taylor-Johnson's character and his family, because that was such an interesting expansion on the original for me. And I thought that was I really enjoyed what they did with that. I really enjoyed the tension between, you know, where do you draw the line with things like hysteria, so to speak. I laughed in the cinema when Orlok turned around. Laughed out loud. And it was a bit, I know I said this earlier, it was a Crimson Peak moment for me, where I was like, is this a quote unquote scary horror movie, or is this a Gothic film? Because the campness, as in the Gothic camp, like capital G, capital C, of that mustache. And I think I was thinking specifically about the Orientalism of it all. That mustache, you know, so I obviously do quite a lot of research, not about the Crusades, but about the way the Crusades have been imagined throughout time. I wouldn't confess to be a historian. I mean, I talk about this in our chivalry episode of the actual Crusade period, but what I am really interested in is the way that the Crusades were imagined by like the beginnings of the British Empire. And they always talk about like the swarthy Saracens, and there's a lot of xenophobia specifically around like Russia, Turkey, that border between Western Europe and the Middle East. And have I got that right? I get my directions mixed up, but hopefully people know what I'm talking about. But mustaches, these big bushy mustaches, is one of the things that people come back to again and again. And obviously you also have things like the high forehead and this figure, this big decaying figure that still has his mustache. To me, there was just something so ridiculous about it that actually made it like, one of the things I really like is when the Gothic is like, the thing you're afraid of is ridiculous.
Yeah.
And therefore you are ridiculous for being afraid of it. So it did make it not scary, but I kind of loved the ridiculousness of it.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. You know, and I understand the reasonings for it. And, you know, I think all power to Robert Eggers for, you know, having a vision and committing to it and standing by it. It didn't work for me.
Yes.
But, you know, I'm one person. What does that matter? You know?
I don't think you were alone, though. A lot of the kind of chatter that I saw on social media afterwards, particularly there's some great TikTok comedy skits of particularly girls dressing up in bald caps as Orlok.
Yeah.
That are really, really funny. But yeah, I do think the mustache was a controversial tipping point for a lot of people.
Yeah. I mean, I think I appreciate his attempts at historical accuracy, but also I think I lean more towards I'd much rather something be stylized and effective than, you know, and it doesn't work for me, but by the by.
Yeah, I do agree. I think if he was going for fear, not repulsion, then it was the wrong choice.
Yeah.
I felt like you were meant to be repulsed by Orlok, not afraid of him, if that makes sense. Like, to me, those are two different...
Yeah.
Like, it is a repulsive figure to look at on screen because of the decay and the nails and everything. And there is some uncomfortable kind of, like, stereotyping around that. But I felt very much like the mustache was part of the, like, oh.
Yeah.
You know.
And I think, I mean, Bill Skarsgård, I think he's a great actor. And he did a really good performance. For me, and I don't know if this was partly the moustache, I found it hard to understand what he was saying. And I don't know if that's because I couldn't see his mouth or because he was mumbling or something. So again, it's just my experience. I have this visual kind of like you know, here's Wario, and I don't really know what he's saying for me. But you know, I don't know. Maybe that's just me. I often watch films with subtitles because I can't understand people. But,
I do agree though. I think that was one of those moments where it's a little bit like when things are really dark and you can't see what's happening, where you're like, I totally understand why it's difficult to tell what he's saying. And part of me was like, is part of the point that it's difficult? Like, Thomas doesn't know what he said. Thomas isn't sure if he's heard him correctly. And that disorientation for the audience. But I think it's always a real risk when you do that kind of thing, because if you make it that dark and you make it accented, you risk people just not knowing what's going on.
Yeah.
So I do agree on that.
Yeah. There were two other like main things that I sounds like I didn't like the film. I enjoyed the film. It wasn't my favorite. So the Roma scene, we can talk about that now if you want to. I really appreciated that there were Roma actors, and I thought that was good. I think it was interesting to kind of position them as vampire hunters in a way. But then I didn't like necessarily the way that it ended up being sexualized, and that kind of, I think for me there was more that could have been done there. I think the effort to address, you know, the anti-Roma in the original material was good. I just personally think that it could have.
I think it's one of those where like the bar is very low because
unfortunately
you know, usually I talked about this on Sundays with like things like Ravenloft. A lot of Dracula inspired stuff they don't call them Roma, but they'll call them like something else, and then it leans into these really like gross stereotypes of Roma people. And there has been this like, we've talked about this before in multiple places, this long-standing sort of use of this negative stereotype of Roma people, often called, you know, in Ravenloft they're not called the Roma, they're like a fantasy version of them, but they're always portrayed as these like, you know, fortune tellers who are, you know, untrustworthy, and sometimes they're on the side of the vampire, or they're like, they'll throw, you know, other people to the vampire to protect themselves. And it's always very you know, very stereotype, very like lazy stereotyping as well. So I did appreciate that, and I think I really appreciated the fact that it did, and you know, we said like, you know, he's repulsive to look at, like that the vampire lore is very folklore-y. Like I kept thinking of the John Stagg vampire poem, which if you've never heard it, go and look at us on YouTube reading it, because that took us fucking hours to record because we kept getting it wrong because it didn't occur to us to record it in sections. But yeah, like I appreciated that. I did think that so the scene where Thomas walks into the settlement and he has that outsider experience, I thought it would be very easy for a viewer that doesn't have the context to still perceive that scene negatively, to align themselves with Thomas rather than align themselves. I think it was almost like I totally appreciate what was going on there, and I liked it as a viewer that has the privilege of informed context. But I did think that if you went into that and you didn't know what was happening there, it would be very easy to like come away being like, oh, poor Thomas, that was a really horrible scene, rather than being like, he's the outsider and he's the intruder and he's the one putting them in danger.
I 100%, I think that's exactly it. You put the nail on the head for me. And I think that's also what I feel in terms of the film, the original film, kind of anti-Semitism. I feel like this film doesn't really do anything. It doesn't, it kind of has those same themes and tropes, and it doesn't address that they can be read in this way, you know, through anti-Semitism. And I think that for me, a good Nosferatu adaptation would be one that does do something different with that.
Yeah. Yeah, like it does an okay job of sort of intimating this idea that like the enlightened society, in rejecting the ancestral knowledge of a people like the Roma, is putting themselves at risk from the vampire. And you have that with Aaron Taylor Johnson's character and his family, and you know, this idea of the enlightened man. You know, that's really scary, that idea that the man that's technically doing everything right can still lose everything because, you know, technically you're not supposed to believe in these superstitions and so on and so forth. I think it just didn't do enough, because it didn't come back to it. There was no kind, like, you're seeing them through Thomas's perspective. So there's you don't have that, like, oh my God, my guy listened to them. Like, you don't have that sort of, I didn't have that intense feeling that you have in other horrors and gothics where you're like, what are you doing, you idiot? You've just been told not to go in there. Like, there wasn't that same like arrogance of man type narrative that you get with some of the sort of, not remakes, but like, you know, a similar sort of thing would be like a Rider Haggard, where there's a lot of very, very harmful stereotypes in there and a lot of exoticism. And some of the horror movies and gothic stories that have reimagined those have very much been like, no, you, the white man, are the idiot because you've ignored and you've not listened and so on and so forth. And again, bar is low. It's not that hard to do that. And I do think it was there, but it's one of the things that always, you know, it's like an itch with Dracula where I'm always like, why is this here? And I think it was right not to cut it because it's such an important part. But I just think it's one of those things where it like never quite gets it right. Never quite. It's better than a lot of other adaptations of, and I'm going to say adaptations of Dracula, but still not quite there. Yeah. I would love to see an adaptation that acknowledges that a little bit more and takes that a little bit more seriously.
Yeah, no, I'm the same. I think, yeah, we're in agreement here. It's good. Do you want to quickly talk about Aaron Taylor Johnson's family, and then we can round this up with a talk about the ending?
Yes. Okay. So one of the things that I love, and I think I've said this before, that The Wicker Man is like one of my favorite of the few I've seen, one of my favorite horror movies. And the thing that I love that genuinely terrifies me about The Wicker Man is the fact that ration, reason, logic has no place. It cannot protect you. It does not matter. You are going to be burned in the big Wicker Man. Like, that is so terrifying to me. And I loved the way that they framed the Enlightenment, because it is set earlier than Dracula as well, isn't it?
I think so, yeah.
And I thought that was really intentional, that it's not, you know, Dracula isn't set in the late, you know, 1890s, it's set earlier, but like that it very specifically places it at a time where the Enlightenment is the big thing. And Aaron Taylor Johnson's character, and I'm going to keep saying that because I can't remember what his name is because I keep getting them all confused. You know, he's the amalgamation of the suit of Lucy's suitors. You know, he is the kind of mixture of those characters. Obviously, you do also have the Doctor, and you have William Dafoe in the brilliant alchemist Van Helsing role. I did absolutely adore him in this film. I thought that was brilliant.
That was my favorite part.
I just really like the way that they tell that story. So it's, you know, Thomas and, oh my God, what's Lily Rose Depp's character called?
Ellen?
My brain is like, me, Ellen, thank you. Because my brain was like Thomas and Mina.
It's confusing.
So, you know, they're their friends, and he's, you know, he is the picture of the enlightened gentleman. he's educated, but he's, you know, he loves his wife, and he is a merchant, but he's not greedy, and he's all of everything that you were supposed to be in the early 19th century. And that is what is his undoing. That is the reason that Orlok is able to come into his home, that his business fails, that his city is overrun, that his children and his wife die, and that he ends up, you know, essentially going insane and taking his own life during a horrifying, unfilled act of necrophilia, as the plague is unraveling over the city. And I think that in not only the context of knowledge and superstition, but also the gender aspects of the film, I think, you know, he's not the bad guy. He's not a bad man. He's not like, well, I'm not listening to you because you're a woman. I'm refusing. It's like this. No, that doesn't make sense. That's not logical. That's not scientific. Like, that's not modern. And I think there was something really great about that aspect of the film and that fear. That, you know, in a time where you've got people taking colloidal silver and selling, you know, wellness cures on social media, and, you know, if you think about that post-pandemic setting for both films, that, you know, that tension between, well, what if though, and like, how do you know? And I thought that was really a really well done representation, and a really compelling, difficult, like, he is likable but unlikable. But then you're like, well, actually he's not wrong. Like, I would probably be him. Like, but because, you know, and you're seeing Ellen's perspective, you're like, no, you idiot, like, listen to her. But he's not actually, like, he's not some kind of bullshit, this stupid woman character. Like, he's actually trying to be compassionate and logical. And I thought that was a really great use of the expansion of the film into a full dialogue, like, you know, going from silent film to kind of full screen. I just thought that was really brilliantly well done. I know a lot of people didn't like him in it, and they thought he was really wooden, but I was like, that's the point.
Yeah.
Like, that's the point. The whole point of what is happening. He's playing it really, really well. You, as the audience member, are supposed to be like, oh my God, you fucking idiot. Like, why aren't you listening? And then you're supposed to go, well, shit, actually, would I believe that? Would I believe that? Like, he is a man of science and a man of reason, and they're all supposed to be good things. They're supposed to be things that we value. Like, he's not a brute. He's not backwards. Like, he's forward and progressive, and it's not enough. Like, it's not that he doesn't believe her because, yeah, she's a silly woman. It's like, well, don't be stupid. Like, that's not possible. I just thought that was really, really good, because they could have done it very differently. And actually, I think it's way more impactful the way that they did do it. That kind of gave me when I thought about it afterwards. So yeah, I thought that was just really good. I really appreciated that. And he had great sideburns.
Yeah, he did. Yeah. And it's a great contrast to Thomas as well.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, if you listen to Some Days with Dracula, you know, we have thoughts about Jonathan. So what were your thoughts on Thomas?
Yeah, I think in both films, so the 1922 film and this one as well, he's exactly what he's meant to be, which is, you know, a bit of a sap and a bit, you know, doesn't really, and doesn't really understand what's happening or what the consequences are of his, you know, his actions or things. Yeah.
I mean, you've heard me say this before. He's very much what I like to call a human wet wipe.
Yeah.
And that is the point.
Yeah.
Like, similarly with Jonathan, like, he has to be for the plot to unfold. What I did really like about this one, and it's a while since I've seen the silent film, so I can't remember if this was so much of a plot point, was the contract aspect. when Orlok says to Ellen, like, well, no, your husband signed this contract, that he couldn't understand. And you have that moment as a viewer where you're like, well, he's there to sign papers. He's there to do this stuff. He's got this pressure on him. He's in this weird place. But then that thing of like signing something that you can't read and you don't understand, you know, for someone who ostensibly is very powerful because he's an old money count, you know, even though you're in this ruined, decrepit, you know, he's buying a house in the city. So, you know that he's supposedly got money. And the way that Lily Rose Depp like her physicality of her acting when that kind of contract scene like is revealed, I really liked that. I thought that was really
I mean, as a solicitor, surely he should bring the papers and he should know what he's signing, you know, in that kind of way. But yeah, I think so. The final point, just so that this episode has an end at some point.
It's not a billion years long.
Let's talk about Lily Rose Depp, Ellen, and the ending in particular, because I have thoughts. I have thoughts about that. But before I say what I think, I want to hear what you think about the ending, if you can remember how it compares to the old one, but also, yeah, like you mentioned, like the physicality of her performance as well.
Yes. I really liked her performance. And this isn't TMI, I'm happy to say this, as someone that has a dissociative disorder, obviously what she's experiencing is not disassociation, she's kind of fitting, but it's similar. I thought they did a very good job at, it's very hard to represent that kind of thing on screen without leaning into the tropes of hysteria and without kind of underselling and undercutting. And I thought she did a really, really good job. And I thought framing it very explicitly as the desperation and the longing of a young woman who is neglected, as so many young women in this period were, like, again, not to kind of be that person, but I was like, yes, these young women were not allowed, you know, it was a very isolated life. And if you didn't have sisters, if you didn't have cousins, if you didn't have a mother, you lived in your father's home, you didn't go to school. The desperate loneliness and longing, and what as a woman that can lead you to inviting in, and in the context of the film, that being inviting in this monstrousness, and that being tied to your sexual desire and your burgeoning sexuality as a young woman. I actually liked a lot the way that was represented. I thought she did a really good job. I go back and forth on what I think about the ending. It kind of reminded me of, do you remember when we went to see Mother? And I was like, that was either the best or the worst thing I've ever seen. And it very much depends on what the intention was.
Yeah.
Like, because there's one version of the ending. So for context, the ending, spoiler alert.
Yeah, spoilers.
They discover that the Nosferatu, this type of vampire, can only be killed, essentially like the maiden who has summoned him. So it's this idea that Nosferatu is almost like an incubus in a way, like it's very explicitly sexualized, and the virgin maiden, or the pure maiden, she's not a virgin, but has to take him to bed, and essentially this is the only way to wait until morning to be able to kill him, but it will kill her in the process.
Well, yeah, because it's essentially it's the same in the 22 film. It's basically the only way to kill this vampire is through sunlight, but in order to get there, you need some kind of distraction or something that will keep the vampire kind of occupied, so that he won't realize how close it is to morning, and then the sun comes up and then the sun kills him. So it's essentially, it is a sacrificial narrative in that in both versions, the woman chooses to kind of, sacrifice herself so that she can keep Orlok with her until the sun comes up, and then the sun will kill him.
Yeah, I really go back and forth. So again, I should have really, if I'd have thought about it, I should have watched it again. But I remember feeling quite sad in the 1922 one. Orlok is quite a sympathetic character. You feel sad for him that he's so in love with Ellen, and it's quite a. It's obviously it's obsessive and it's monstrous, but there's a sort of sympathy for the other that the 1922 film gives you. And the reason I go back and forth on the 2024 version is that Ellen is the other as well.
Yeah.
As Orlok. And either it's a story about the fact that female sexual desire cannot exist in this society because the implication is that she actually enjoys it, that she desires sexual intercourse with him, that she summoned him and bound him to her through her desire to realize herself and through her desire to be desired, and that actually Thomas could not fulfill her. Thomas was not enough for her, and that the tragedy of the film is not like, oh, you know, Orlok, the poor guy, in a way, but like that Ellen could not exist within this patriarchal, enlightened society because it doesn't leave any space for sexual desire in women, that sexual desire in women is automatically deviant, and that, you know, the only way for her to be fulfilled is to be consumed by Orlok, because of course he's drinking her blood, but to have this, you know, repeated sexual fulfillment over the course of the night. And she's almost resentful when they arrive in the morning, even though she's decided to do it. So one version of it I felt was very, not empowering, but like just this real visceral, like, fuck you moment of like, there is no space. There is no space. By not permitting sexual desire, you automatically demonize it. And by demonizing it, you push women to this extreme. They cannot live a fulfilled and happy life. And Ellen's sacrifice is also an act of agency and her taking control of her sexuality. I think there's some, you know, there's almost some suggestion that perhaps she was sexually abused as a child and that, you know, she's seeking that control. So if I read it that way, I really like the ending. But that very much depends if that was the intention, because the other version is that it's this unfulfilling, disappointing sacrifice narrative that doesn't quite meet the mark, that tries to do something very feminist and say, this is men's fault. Men always cause the destruction of women. But because she chooses to do it rather than, you know, going out, you know, with the professor and with Thomas, and they have this whole plan, and partway through Thomas realizes it's a ruse. Like the fact that the professor just is like, man, this is the only way. It's the only way. We can't try anything else. We can't, you know, there's simply nothing else we could possibly do apart from allow him to copulate with you and drink your blood until you are spent and then he burns to death. There's no other way for us to do this. Like, there's no... And there is that kind of like moment where she's sort of like, she's not like, I'm going to do this. In the silent film, she's kind of like, no, I'll do this for the good of the people and for my love. Lily Rose Depp's Ellen is very like, you've all fucking driven me to this because none of you listen to me. Like, this is all of your faults, but also I can't exist. I can't be happy. Like my happiness was always cursed because I'm not accepted. Which, yeah, if I read it the first way, I really like it.
Yeah.
If I read it the second way, I'm really unfulfilled by it. And I don't know, I'm not sure which version is the truth.
I think that's really interesting because I really like the original ending of the 1922 version. I'm not a massive fan of sacrifice narratives, but I think, especially for the 1920s, it's really interesting that you have a sacrifice narrative where the person who is choosing to do it and is doing the sacrificing is a woman. And I really liked that. I think that's great and really interesting, especially because the kind of the Thomas character is so like useless And it's like,
so useless.
Yes, so useless. And it's like, yes, so she's gone and done this research. She's found out what she needs to do, and she's gone and done it. And then the monster is vanquished. I think with Eggers' film, I thought Lily Rose's that, like, her performance was great. I don't have any, notes.
No
notes. I think it was really good. But what I think I find problematic is the way that she's characterized. Like, for me, it's falling into something that I think is quite lazy and tired, in that there's this association of women and women's sexuality with evil and monstrosity. And for me, the fact that this monster, like Orlok the vampire, was kind of awoken by her desire, I think, is a problem. And the fact that he's coming to her because she's called for him is a problem. And then the fact that, she has to, it's almost like they're in agreement, like, he's bad, and also this part of her is bad, and he's, for me, that's a problem. And I found myself thinking, I prefer the original version.
Yeah, I totally get that, because I think that's what I'm torn between is that on the one hand, they frame it very clearly as being not her fault that this happens at the beginning, and you can read it in the way of something like The Power, where it's like, well, you won't listen to us when we keep telling you the way this hurts women, so maybe we need to show you how this drives women to do monstrous things. And then part of me really likes that narrative, but part of me is like, wait, am I giving you too much grace?
Yeah.
Like,
yeah.
I go back and forth on it. Because I'm not such a fan of the original ending. But I, in general, really don't like sacrifice narratives. Because, and I think that's the war scholar in me coming out. As a religious scholar, I don't like sacrifice narratives, but I do find them interesting in the way that people, and like I say, I think if it had been anyone other than Ellen who does that, then it's, Yeah. The one thing that I do really like, regardless of how I feel about it, is how violent the sacrifice is. Because I think, again, in the context of, like, the original being a post-war film, both of them being post-pandemic films, most sacrifice narratives that we get, even in horror, are often quite angelic. Like, the person walks into the fire, or they, turn and then they throw themselves into the pit of, there's this kind of, like, sacrifice is, messianic, or it is saintly, or it is whatever, even in otherwise quite violent films, whereas this sacrifice is drawn out, it's painful.
Well, it's almost, it's kind of embodying that whole kind of idea of the theology of suffering, which you do get in some horror films, actually, where the person that, especially in, like, the possession genre, where it's like,
that's true,
the woman has to undergo physical torment and intense, like, violence in order to complete her sacrifice.
Do you think, so this is one thing that I walked away from being like, I don't know whether or not it's in the direction or if it's Lily Rose Depp's performance, but, like, how did you read Ellen at the end? Because that moment where Thomas and the professor walk into the room, I read that moment as very resentful, that she is like, there's an anger there, even though the film does kind of imply that she has fulfilled a sexual desire of her own. But when they come in the room, like, even though it was her choice, like, and I think this is one of the things that maybe swayed me towards thinking that was the intention, was that she seems angry when they come in, and she seems resentful, and it's like, you've pushed me to this and I had to do this because there's no other way, and this shouldn't be, like, the way it is. And she's not, like, she is still kind of like, oh, I loved you and things like that, but, like, I don't know, there was a real bitterness to that scene that did, I think that was the one thing that made me be like, oh,
I think that's
maybe
yeah, I think that's interesting, and I think that's something that I would have to pay attention to more on a rewatch, But I think that's actually a really good question to end on, which is to invite people to let us know what you think about.
Yeah, what did you think about the ending?
The ending and the character of Ellen. And yeah, just what are your thoughts on the film? Did you like it? Are you mixed? What were your favourite things about it? Yeah.
My question to you is, would you watch it again?
I would watch it again. Yeah,
me too.
Probably not anytime soon.
Yeah. It's very much one of those that I didn't come out and go, oh my God, that was amazing. But I didn't come out and think, oh, I really didn't like that. That was disappointing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you want to know the thing that made me think of... Can you guess what made me think of you in that film?
Oh.
Before we finish.
The cat? No.
No. The scene where Thomas is walking and he gets to the crossroads and that's where the... carriage appears and the door opens.
I think I even I nudged Craig in the cinema being like, ah.
It's like crossroads.
Yeah.
Yeah, that is our... I mean, I guess it is a review. You know, we have talked about what we thought about it. We're not really in the... We don't... Despite doing ratings in the other... in the So You Think You Don't Like Horror, we're not doing ratings in these review episodes. We're just shooting the shit about what we think about things. But
yeah,
stay tuned for the next one. We've got some more content coming up. And if there's something you would like us to read, watch... play, you know, a Gothic text you would like our thoughts on, then please let us know. And in the meantime, stay safe and stay spooky.
Stay safe and stay spooky.